So as I woke up this morning and was trying to decide what I wanted to do a video on, something caught my eye, and that was ESPN updating their FPI index. And there were some really interesting and cool things in here, and it actually put me in a position where I have more questions than answers in the best way possible, and we're going to work it all out together right here. But before we do, as always, y'all know the drill. I want to hear from y'all. Hop down to the comments, give me a Y for yes or an N for no. Do you agree with ESPN's FPI index? And let me know what you're thinking there, and we're going to have a lot to talk about. But if you enjoy this and you are not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell notification. I do constant college football content. You don't want to miss any of it. And if you enjoyed that content, be sure to like and comment down below. Those interactions are massive to content creators such as myself. But with all of that being said, let's dive into this. And first and foremost, let's talk about the updated top 10 teams for ESPN's FPI index. And the FPI, first and foremost, is just kind of a measure of strength, kind of used to look holistically at how your team matches up before the season starts. And if we're looking at the top 10, we have a top 10 of Alabama, Clemson, OU, Ohio State, Georgia, A&M, Texas, Notre Dame, Iowa State, and Miami. Now, first and foremost, there are some really interesting things to consider here. The first being that the former ESPN FPI index, before they did the updated one, had Texas sitting outside the top 10 at 12. What's also equally as interesting about this week we got the poll from the Big 12 media, and the Big 12 media ranked the Big 12 teams as OU 1, Iowa State 2, and Texas 3. So we're actually seeing a flip from the Big 12 media poll for that 2 and 3 spot within the Big 12 per ESPN's FPI index, which is very interesting to me when you look at the Texas Longhorns being in a state of transition in a positive way. You have a very creative play caller, and I suppose when you look at it, when you have a creative play caller, a bevy of talented running backs, and a incredibly talented running back in Bijan Robinson, who I'm not quite sure how he was left off the Pro Football Focus top 50 college football players this upcoming season, but he was, and that is a travesty in and of itself, but that's a conversation for a different day. When you have a creative play caller, a bunch of talented running backs, and then Bijan, who is the talented running back amongst a room full of talented running backs, you can make some things happen. On the flip side to that, though, Iowa State returns a lot of talent. They're a very well-coached team. They're a very disciplined team, and the bulk of that team comes back with a mission in place. It is going to be an uphill battle trying to beat Iowa State, but I have talked about this in the past, that I do completely agree with the top three being OU, and then whatever order you want of Iowa State, Texas, Texas, Iowa State. Personally, for the time being, I would probably put Iowa State, then Texas, for the simple reason of Iowa State returning so much talent to that team. Breece Hall being there, Brock Purdy coming back, Mike Rose, the linebacker, and then you look at the tight ends and the way they play their offense. Though Texas has a lot of answers now, both with a creative offensive play caller in Sark and a brilliant defensive mind in PK, I think that Iowa State returns so much talent that I can see where the Big 12 media puts them ahead, but I can also understand the thinking that people have that Texas could take some games this year that people don't expect them to, and Iowa State could be one of those games. That's a game I'm very much looking forward to, but that's one of those areas where, first and foremost, I'm interested in hearing from y'all where y'all believe that flip should be. Should it be OU, Iowa State, Texas, OU, Texas, Iowa State? That right there was one of the first questions I have, but it also flips back to something that I think we need to look at for OU, which is right now, if we look at this, the Big 12 sits 3 teams within the top 10 of ESPN's FPI index. That right there has to be music to your ears, although you don't want to drop any game. I think that that's one thing that no matter how the schedule may look, and even if you were playing a schedule that included 10 teams in the ESPN top 25 in FPI, you still don't want to drop a game because then you're putting the decision in someone else's hands. And OU ultimately this year not only has the talent to keep the decision out of anybody else's hands, but they have the means to keep the decision out of anybody else's hands, and that's what they should look to go do. But it's really intriguing to me when we're looking at the top 4 specifically in Bama, Clemson, OU, and Ohio State, because this is a really consistent top 4 we're seeing across the board from multiple different people thinking these will be the 4 playoff teams, and it's easy to understand why. Alabama just kind of seems to have a home in the college football playoffs. Nick Saban reloads. They don't rebuild, they reload. And this group they have coming up, It's going to experience growing pains. The question is how much of those growing pains are going to come about, how quickly they're solved, but they have a lot to replace. They're going to experience growing pains. It's just whether that will take a few quarters, whether that will take a game. This team, though, make no mistake, in Alabama, is unbelievably talented. Bryce Young being one of the highest rated quarterbacks of the modern era of recruiting. Mechie was only short of 1,000 yards by about 50 yards last year, and there are some dudes on that receiving core that are going to be household names. You can take that to the bank. But the interesting thing for Alabama is if we're looking at the top 4 teams in the ESPN top 10 in the FPI index, Alabama actually has the lowest chance to win their conference amongst these top 4 teams, while maintaining the second highest percentage chance to not only make the playoffs, but to make the national championship. And the interesting thing about that, and the reason is because the SEC leads the way with the most teams placed on the top 25 of the ESPN FPI index with 8. And specifically, if you look at it within the top 10, Alabama's on a collision course, or could be on a collision course, for 3 teams within this top 10. They opened the season against Miami, which is awesome for the Crimson Tide that Miami is getting this in a top 10 look per ESPN FPI, because that's only going to help the Tide if they can get past Miami down the stretch. They're going to be able to point back to that game saying, we opened with a quality opponent, we handled a quality opponent, and we haven't looked back. That right there is something that I think the Crimson Tide love to hang their hat on when they open with these week 1 opponents like they have in the past, whether that be USC when USC's ranked well, Florida State when Florida State's ranked well, Wisconsin when Wisconsin was ranked well. The result of the games may not have been pretty, but prior to the games, a lot of people were thinking these were going to be great contests with 2 teams matched up and 2 teams that looked to be high-ranking teams, and it's no different this year. Now we just have to see how it plays out on the field. I think that the biggest questions I have now revolve around the ACC specifically, because when you're looking at Clemson is in a position that when you look at the top 25 of the ESPN FPI index, you notice that Clemson's schedule is really a walk in the park, absent that week 1 against Georgia, which brings up the question I have been asking for a long time, and that is, does that week 1 game, Georgia versus Clemson, hold playoff implications for Clemson? Because I'm going to pose a scenario now, and this scenario could cut multiple ways, but because it's Georgia playing Clemson, this is the scenario we're going to pose. If Georgia wins against Clemson and then wins out the rest of their schedule, and then faces an Alabama Crimson Tide team that rolls into the SEC championship undefeated, if Alabama defeats Georgia by a slim margin, is Georgia to be left out of the college football playoff if Clemson goes on to win the ACC conference, even though they have the 1 loss to Georgia? And that's why I say this can get really interesting right here, because there is a plausible scenario where Clemson could drop week 1 to Georgia, win out because they don't play Miami, they don't play North Carolina until the inevitable ACC championship. Is there a situation where Clemson drops that week 1 game, wins out, wins their conference championship, and is still left out of the playoffs? I find it unlikely given the nature of Clemson, given how consistent they've been. I think they'd get a nod, and conference championships, I agree, should mean something. But at the end of the day, we also should acknowledge that if this situation is to occur, it might not, so it might be a moot point altogether, but if this situation is to occur, we talked about that yes, Georgia might not have won their conference championship, but they did beat Clemson in a head-to-head, and they had to play a more grueling schedule. But at the end of the day, it all depends on how these teams finish. I cannot wait for the college football season to start, and lists like this, though in the long run they are ultimately meaningless because the only thing that matters is what happens on the field, they sure are fun to talk about and kind of do thought exercises with. And the thought exercises of this list are plenty. Texas vaulting inside the top 10 from 12 and overtaking Iowa State, which is really interesting. You have Alabama, who among the 4 playoff teams looks to have the lowest percentage chance to win their conference, but has the second highest percentage chance to make the playoffs and make the national championship, which that right there lets you know what the FPI at least thinks of the Crimson Tide moving into 2021. But we see a consistent of the top 4 teams being any variation of Alabama, Clemson, OU, and Ohio State. So with that, hop down in the comments, let me know what you're thinking about all of this, because there is a lot to process here. There's a lot of awesome information, and there's a lot of really key questions that aren't going to be answered until the season starts and ultimately until the playoffs come around, but we can start thinking about them right now. So let me know what you're thinking about them. That's it. See ya.